Bristol General Hospital was an austere but essential place for the community in the city of Bristol, England. Founded in the 19th century, the hospital had a reputation for practical efficiency, with wide corridors, worn tiled floors, and a silence interrupted only by the hurried footsteps and murmurs of nurses. However, there was something unusual hidden in this place, something that even the skeptics preferred to ignore. Olive, the owl that inhabited the hospital's attic. Nobody knew for sure how Olive had gotten there. The little church owl used to fly silently over the hospital corridors at night, her pale feathers reflecting the moonlight. For most of the staff, she was just a peculiar presence, a detail that gave the hospital a personality of its own. But for Dr. Thomas Wilkes, a middle-aged clinician with a sharp curiosity, Olive seemed to be more than just a winged visitor. One evening, while reviewing reports in the small office in the East Wing, Dr. Wilkes noticed something unusual. Olive came down from the attic and landed on one of the corridor doors. She stood there for long minutes, her large, penetrating eyes fixed on something inside the room. Intrigued, Thomas got up and walked slowly towards the door where the owl was standing. He recognized the room number. It was the bed of Mr. Arthur Crowley, a 72-year-old man in critical condition after heart complications. Thomas entered the room carefully. Olive flew to the windowsill and continued to watch, motionless, as Mr. Crowley slept soundly. There was nothing out of the ordinary on the heart monitor or the vital signs displayed on the equipment next to the patient. Even so, the owl's behavior disturbed Thomas. The next morning, while Dr. Wilkes was making his rounds, he was informed that Mr. Crowley had passed away during the night with no signs of agony, as if he had simply slipped into an eternal sleep. The news brought a strange feeling of déjà vu. Was it coincidence? Or did Olive know something that humans couldn't perceive? Over the next few days, Thomas began to observe the owl more closely. He noticed that whenever Olive landed on a specific door, something invariably happened to the patient inside the room. The doctor's curiosity quickly turned to concern, but he wasn't yet ready to share his suspicions with his colleagues. That night, as the hospital plunged into almost total silence, Olive repeated the same behavior. She landed on the doorstep of another room, this time that of Grace Whitaker, a woman with terminal cancer. Dr. Wilkes, unable to ignore the pattern, sat down in a chair in the corridor and waited. He remained there until dawn, only to discover at daybreak that Grace had quietly left during the night. And so began the mystery that would surround not only Olive, but the entire Bristol hospital. The corridors of Bristol General began to carry a weight that no one could explain, a feeling that intensified every time Olive went on her silent nightly patrol. At first, the staff treated her presence as a harmless quirk, but as more deaths coincided with the owl's visits, rumors began to circulate. The head nurse, Margaret Phelps, was the first to express her concerns openly. During a shift change, she commented in a low voice while sorting out charts. "Have you noticed how that owl seems to predict deaths?" The other nurses stared at her, some laughing nervously, others looking away. It was a thought that none of them wanted to admit, but they couldn't ignore the facts. Olive always seemed to be present in the final moments of terminally ill patients. Dr. Wilkes, who couldn't shake the mystery from his mind either, began to record Olive's visits in a small notebook. He carefully noted down the times and places where the owl appeared. Within a few days, the connection became too clear to be dismissed as mere coincidence. The owl seemed to be able to identify, with uncanny accuracy, the patients whose hours were being counted. A particularly quiet night brought more answers and also more questions. The hospital was plunged into silence, with only the distant sound of breathing machines and sporadic footsteps. Thomas was in the downstairs break room, leafing through an article on recent studies in animal behavior, when Margaret rushed in. "Dr. Wilkes, you need to see this," she said, panting. He followed her into the West Wing, where a group of nurses looked on with a mixture of awe and fascination. Olive was perched on the bed of Edith Calloway, an elderly woman with respiratory failure. The owl made no movement, its eyes fixed on the patient who was sleeping peacefully. Thomas checked Edith's vital signs. Although her condition was serious, the devices didn't indicate anything alarming. However, a few hours later, Edith passed away serenely, just like the other patients marked by the owl's visit. The incident made it impossible to ignore the pattern, even for the most skeptical. Margaret looked at Thomas with an expression that mixed fear and hope. "What do you think this means, doctor?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but I need to find out." Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the hospital became increasingly strange. The patients, many of them terminally ill, began to notice Olive's presence. For some, the owl was a terrible omen. For others, a form of consolation, a silent guardian who accompanied them in their final moments. One night, while Dr. Wilkes was analyzing the owl's behavior patterns, something unexpected happened. Olive landed on the railing of the upper floor and remained motionless, observing the room of a young man called Henry Morris, a man of 27 hospitalized with kidney failure. Henry's case was not critical, and everyone expected him to recover. Confused, Thomas decided to monitor the patient overnight. Meanwhile, the neighboring ward housed Clara Wright, a retired nurse who had been hospitalized for a case of pneumonia. Her condition was stable, and she was due to be discharged the following day. However, in the early hours of the morning, her monitoring alarms went off. Thomas and his team rushed to Clara's room, but it was too late. She had died suddenly and inexplicably. At the same time, Henry remained stable. When Thomas returned to Henry's room, he found Olive still there, perched at the window. For the first time, he had the feeling that the owl was trying to communicate something. But what? Olive's pattern seemed to have broken down. She was not only warning of expected deaths, but also confounding all medical predictions. The team, now torn between skepticism and superstition, began to treat her with a mixture of respect and fear. "It doesn't make sense, Margaret," Thomas confessed as he reviewed Clara and Henry's reports. How did she know Clara was in danger if the monitors didn't even detect it? Margaret, who was beginning to embrace the mystery, answered cautiously, "Maybe she knows more than we do. Maybe there's something that science can't yet explain." Olive's mystery continued to grow, as did the impact of her presence in the hospital. And for Dr. Wilkes, the answers seemed further and further away. The next morning began with an unusual silence at Bristol General. Nurses and doctors exchanged furtive glances as they passed each other in the corridors. Clara Wright's death, unexpected and unexplained, had put the team on alert. However, what intrigued Dr. Wilkes most was Olive's behavior. She seemed to have deliberately chosen the wrong room. For the first time, the seemingly infallible owl had missed its mark. Or had she? Dr. Wilkes spent the morning analyzing Clara and Henry's medical reports, looking for any clue that might explain the events of the night before. Nothing made sense. Clara's tests indicated a stable recovery, while Henry, although in critical condition, remained unchanged. Thomas began to wonder if he was looking at the right data. Perhaps the answers lay not in the machines or the medical records, but in something beyond scientific comprehension. Meanwhile, in the East Ward, Olive continued to make her nightly rounds. Nurses reported that the owl now seemed more restless, moving from room to room, without settling in one place for long. For some, this was a relief. For others, the uncertainty was even more terrifying. After all, Olive was no longer a reliable harbinger of death. That night, Dr. Wilkes made a bold decision. Determined to unravel the mystery, he positioned discreet cameras in the corridors and rooms of the ward where Olive used to appear. He also enlisted the help of Margaret, who, although skeptical at first, now shared his obsession with understanding the link between the owl and the patients. "Let's find out what she's really seeing," said Thomas as he adjusted the last camera. Margaret nodded, visibly uncomfortable. I hope we're prepared for what we're going to find. Around midnight, while reviewing the video monitors in the small office, Thomas noticed something intriguing. Olive had quietly entered Henry Morris's room, just like the night before. But instead of perching in a corner or at the window, she climbed down onto the patient's bed, getting close to his chest. The scene seemed surreal. Olive tilted her head, as if she was hearing something. Thomas hurried to Henry's room. When he entered, the owl had already returned to the window, but something on the monitor caught his eye. The young man's vital signs were dropping rapidly. "We need help here," shouted Thomas, pressing the emergency button. The medical team rushed to stabilize Henry. After agonizing minutes, they managed to stabilize him, but only temporarily. The young man was rushed to the ICU, where he would remain under constant surveillance. Thomas, now exhausted, stood outside his room, watching as Olive flew silently out of the window. Meanwhile, something even more unexpected was happening on another floor of the hospital. Nurse Alice, who rarely interacted with Thomas or Margaret, decided to investigate the room next to Clara Wright, which had been empty since her death. Upon entering, she smelled something strange, something she later described as chemical, almost metallic. Not knowing what to do, Alice notified the cleaning staff, but the presence of that smell continued to disturb her. Later, while reviewing Nurse Alice's notes, Thomas began to outline a bold theory. What if Olive wasn't just predicting deaths? What if she was reacting to something that humans couldn't perceive? Perhaps chemical changes or even energies that preceded critical events. This theory, however, was put to the test the next day, when Olive did something completely unexpected. During the morning shift, she went down to the waiting room, where she perched on the shoulder of a woman called Abigail Ford, who was just there to visit her hospitalized mother. The staff stopped what they were doing to observe the scene. Olive had never interacted directly with visitors before. "This can't be good," Margaret whispered to Thomas. But nothing happened. Abigail finished her visit without incident and went home. Olive's behavior seemed increasingly chaotic and impossible to decipher. The break in Olive's pattern brought more questions than answers. At the end of the day, while reviewing the events with Margaret, Thomas spoke with a tone of frustration. "We're missing something. Some piece of this puzzle is missing, and I don't know what it is." Margaret, normally the voice of reason, looked at him seriously. "What if we never understand? What if some things simply have no explanation?" But Thomas wasn't willing to give up so easily. Olive's erratic behavior, combined with the unexplained events surrounding the patients, made him feel that the truth was within reach, even if it slipped through his fingers. In the silence of the hospital, as Olive flew back up to the attic, it seemed that she, like the whole hospital, held secrets that no one was prepared to face. At Bristol General Hospital, the tension became more and more palpable. Patients and staff looked at Olive with conflicting feelings. For some, the owl represented a bad omen. For others, a figure of comfort. Rumors spread through the corridors, fed by stories from nurses and visitors. It was common to hear phrases like, "If Olive lands in your room, prepare for the worst." On the other hand, some terminally ill patients began to see the owl's presence as an act of compassion. Margaret noticed this in her conversation with Eleanor Porter, an 84-year-old woman who was in her last days due to advanced cancer. "I'm not afraid of her, my dear," said Eleanor, smiling faintly. "She's just coming to make sure I'm not alone." These words stuck in Margaret's mind as the mystery of Olive grew. Was it possible that the owl was more than an omen, perhaps a kind of silent comforter for those facing the inevitable? That night, Dr. Thomas Wilkes decided to personally monitor Olive, positioning himself in the corridor of the North Ward, where the most critical patients were admitted. He knew it was only a matter of time before the owl appeared. And he was right. At around 2 in the morning, Olive swooped silently down from a beam in the ceiling and landed at the bedside of Philip Barnes, a 62-year-old man admitted with liver failure. The room was dark, lit only by the dim light of the monitors. Thomas watched closely, his eyes alternating between the owl and the patient's vital signs, which were stable. Olive tilted her head, as if listening to something Thomas couldn't pick up. After a few minutes, she flew to the window and disappeared into the darkness of the night. Intrigued, Thomas remained in the room. Philip's signals remained stable until dawn. The next morning, Philip was transferred to a less critical ward. It seemed that Olive had made another mistake. Or did she know something that nobody else knew? Meanwhile, Margaret decided to investigate another lead. Inspired by Eleanor Porter's words, she began interviewing other patients who had been visited by Olive. In many cases, she found something surprising. The patients described an inexplicable sense of calm when the owl was present. "It was as if she knew I was scared and wanted to calm me down," said Richard Holt, a man with terminal lung disease. This pattern began to change Margaret's perception of Olive. Perhaps the owl wasn't an omen of death, but a messenger of comfort. Despite this, fear still prevailed among many staff and visitors. In the hospital cafeteria, quiet conversations became commonplace. "It's not normal, you know," said a young nurse to a colleague. "Animals shouldn't act like that." "Maybe it's something spiritual," suggested the other, hesitantly. Thomas, who was in the cafeteria at the time, overheard the conversation but remained silent. He knew that Olive's situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. The hospital was becoming a place of mystery and tension. That same night, while Margaret was making her rounds, she found Olive perched on the bedside of another patient, a man called Edward Norris. He was hospitalized due to acute heart failure and, according to the reports, had only a few hours to live. Margaret felt a chill, but decided to stay in the room. Edward, who was conscious, looked at Margaret and whispered, "She's here for me, isn't she?" Margaret hesitated before answering. Maybe she's here so you don't feel alone." Edward smiled faintly, closed his eyes, and, a few minutes later, left serenely. Margaret left the room with tears in her eyes, touched by the experience. She met Thomas in the hallway and told him what had happened. "I don't know what to think anymore, Thomas," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe Olive is more than we imagined." Thomas, still struggling to find a rational explanation, replied, "She continues to defy everything we know. But one thing is clear. She's not just an ordinary animal." As Olive's mystery deepened, a bigger question hung in the air. What did she really see or feel that no one else could perceive? And, in that hospital increasingly torn between fear and acceptance, Olive continued her silent vigil, while Thomas and Margaret tried to decipher what seemed to be an impossible enigma. The mystery of Olive was beyond Thomas Wilkes. He knew he needed answers. That morning, he called an expert in animal behavior, Dr. Ian Calloway, a renowned zoologist at Cambridge University. After explaining the situation, Ian accepted the invitation to visit the hospital and observe the owl in action. Ian arrived at Bristol General with a suitcase of sophisticated equipment and an obvious curiosity. He greeted Thomas and Margaret in the main corridor. "Looks like we have a fascinating visitor," said Ian, adjusting his glasses. "Animals, especially birds of prey, have highly developed senses. It's possible that Olive is reacting to chemical or energetic changes that we can't perceive." Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. Finally, someone could bring clarity to the mystery that haunted the hospital. That night, Ian positioned audio and frequency sensors around the North Ward and where Olive used to appear. He also prepared high-definition cameras and equipment that detected changes in the levels of chemical compounds in the air. "If there's anything to explain her behavior, we'll find out tonight," Ian assured us. Around midnight, Olive made her entrance. She descended silently from the attic and landed at the bedside of Maria Henderson, a terminally ill patient with respiratory failure. Ian carefully watched the monitors and graphs on the laptop connected to the sensors. The levels of carbon dioxide and organic compounds in the room were slightly elevated, something that could indicate Maria's deteriorating condition. "Fascinating," Ian murmured. "It could be that Olive is noticing these chemical changes even before the monitors." Thomas, although intrigued, remained skeptical. It still doesn't explain why she seems to be so precise, and why she sometimes visits patients who aren't in immediate danger. At dawn, Ian's data was collected and analyzed. There were patterns, but also discrepancies. Olive seemed to react to certain chemical changes in the air, but not always. This only added more questions to the mystery. Ian looked at Thomas with a serious expression. "I'm convinced that she's perceiving something that goes beyond conventional science. Perhaps it's electromagnetism, or even something we can't measure with our current instruments." Margaret, who was present, asked, "What if it's not scientific? What if it's something spiritual?" Ian smiled slightly, but didn't dismiss the idea. Science and the spiritual often intersect in ways we don't fully understand. Perhaps Olive is a window onto something greater. That same night, something unexpected happened. Olive broke her pattern again. Instead of visiting Maria Henderson, who died peacefully in her bed, she entered the room of a man called Howard Briggs, a stable patient recovering from orthopedic surgery. Howard looked confused when he saw the owl perched on the arm of the armchair next to his bed. "Is this some kind of joke?" Howard asked the nurses, who didn't know what to say. Olive stayed in the room for almost an hour before leaving. Later that evening, Howard suffered a sudden cardiac arrest and died. The doctors were perplexed. There had been no previous indication that he was in any danger. Thomas and Margaret discussed the event the following day. "That doesn't make sense," said Thomas, exasperated. "How can she predict something that even the monitors haven't detected?" Margaret replied with a tired look on her face. "Maybe that's exactly it. Olive isn't following our prediction methods. She's operating on a completely different level." While the medical team tried to rationalize the events, the patients began to share their own theories. Some believed that Olive was a messenger of death, while others saw her as a kind of guardian angel. The hospital was now divided not only between science and spirituality, but also between fear and hope. At the end of the week, Ian returned to Cambridge, leaving Thomas with more questions than answers. Before leaving, he said something that would stay in the doctor's mind for a long time. "There are times when we need to accept that the world is more complex than our tools can measure. Olive may be a piece of something much bigger than any of us." Thomas, although reluctant, began to consider this possibility. And as Olive continued her rounds, he knew he was getting closer to a truth he might never fully understand. The weeks passed, and the mystery of Olive became a constant presence in everyday life at Bristol General. Staff, patients, and even visitors were fascinated or haunted by the little owl that seemed to be more than just an animal. Olive's reputation spread beyond the hospital walls, attracting onlookers, journalists, and even spiritual groups who saw her as a divine sign. For Thomas Wilkes, every day was a struggle between accepting the inexplicable and searching for answers. He spent endless nights reviewing the data Ian Calloway had left and consulting experts in various fields. Nothing was conclusive. However, something Margaret said echoed in his mind. Perhaps Olive's purpose is not to predict death, but to teach us how to accept it. One morning, Thomas was rushed to the West Wing. Olive had entered the room of Eleanor Porter, the elderly patient who used to speak calmly about death. Margaret was at Eleanor's side, holding her hand. "She's leaving, Thomas," said Margaret, her voice trembling. Eleanor, conscious, looked at Thomas and smiled. "Don't be afraid, Doctor. Olive told me I wouldn't be alone." Thomas felt a chill. He knew the woman was delirious, but her words carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Minutes later, Eleanor breathed her last, with Olive still perched on the headboard. That day, something changed in Thomas. He decided that instead of trying to control the mystery, he would accept Olive's presence as part of life in the hospital. He called a meeting with the staff and spoke openly for the first time. Olive may be a mystery, but her presence has offered comfort to many. Instead of fearing her, let's embrace the positive impact she has brought. The reaction was mixed, but most agreed. For the staff who worked directly with terminally ill patients, Olive was a symbol of acceptance, a companion for those facing their final moments. The days passed, and Olive continued her rounds. But something seemed different. She started visiting patients who weren't close to death, spending hours in rooms where people were stable or even recovering. This confused the doctors even more, but brought unexpected relief to many patients, who came to see her as a symbol of luck or hope. One such patient was Lucas Hamilton, a 9-year-old boy who was recovering from a bone marrow transplant. He was delighted when Olive landed on his window. "She's come to tell me I'm going to be all right," said Lucas enthusiastically to his mother, who smiled with emotion. Meanwhile, Margaret was reflecting on everything she had witnessed. In a conversation with Thomas, she confessed, "I think Olive has shown us something important. No matter how much we try to control or understand life, there are things we simply have to accept, and death is one of them." Thomas silently agreed. He knew that Olive had changed not only the hospital, but also his own view of life and death. The climax came on a rainy night. A patient called James Radcliffe, who had been in critical condition in the ICU for months, collapsed. The medical team worked tirelessly to stabilize him, but it seemed inevitable that he would not survive the night. Olive, as if she knew, entered the room and perched on the back of the chair next to the bed. James R., who was conscious despite the seriousness of his condition, looked at the owl with a mixture of fear and acceptance. "Thank you for being here," he murmured, before closing his eyes forever. For Thomas and Margaret, who watched the scene from outside the room, that moment was the closing of a cycle. Olive was not a messenger of death, nor a guardian of lives. She was, in some inexplicable way, a presence that brought people together in their most vulnerable moments. Over time, Olive became a symbol of the hospital, a silent reminder that life and death were part of the same cycle. Thomas and Margaret continued their careers, but never forgot the impact that little owl had on their lives and those of so many others. And Olive, with her silent wings and piercing gaze, continued to fly through the corridors, bringing inexplicable comfort to those who needed it. Months turned into years, and Olive continued to be a constant figure at Bristol General. The corridors of the hospital, once just a place for treatments and farewells, now housed a story that resonated far beyond its walls. The owl became a universal symbol, and its legacy spread throughout the city of Bristol and even beyond. A plaque was placed discreetly at the entrance to the hospital with a simple inscription, "Olive, the Silent Guardian." May her legacy remind us to accept the mystery of life and death. Patients and visitors often stopped to read the inscription, moved by the impact the owl had on those who crossed its path. Olive continued her routine, flying from room to room, never predictable, but always there when she was needed most. Thomas Wilkes decided to write a book about his experience, entitled Wings of Mystery, Olive's Story. He used the book as a way of exploring not only the owl's presence, but also his own reflections on the fragility and resilience of life. The book became an unexpected success, touching hearts around the world. Margaret Phelps was also deeply impacted by her time with Olive. After decades of working at Bristol General, she retired and began lecturing on palliative care and the emotional impact of working with terminally ill patients. "Olive taught me more than any training could have done," she said in her presentations. "True care is not just about healing, but about being present in the moments that matter most." One night, during a particularly violent storm, something unusual happened. Olive didn't appear in any of the corridors. Staff and patients noticed her absence with concern. Thomas, now director of the hospital, went up to the attic to look for her. When he got there, he found only an empty nest, with a few feathers left behind. He stood there for a few minutes, looking at the empty space where Olive used to rest. A mixture of sadness and gratitude filled him. "Goodbye, my friend," he whispered. "Thank you for everything." After that night, Olive was never seen again. Despite this, her presence remained alive in the hearts of everyone at Bristol General. The hospital was never the same again. Olive left a legacy that transcended science, spirituality, and even time. Some say that, on particularly silent nights, they can still hear the soft sound of her wings in the hospital attic. Others claim to feel his presence when they need comfort the most. But for Thomas and all those who lived through that unique experience, Olive will always be more than an owl. She will be remembered as a mystery, a symbol, and, above all, a reminder that not all puzzles need solving.